They say magic never truly dies, but on one fateful night, the Mages Guild learned otherwise. Tonight, we uncover the secret conspiracy that brought down the most powerful magical institution in Tamriel, and the forbidden spells that died with it. Welcome, my sleepy travelers, to another journey through the mystical realms of the Elder Scrolls. I'm your guide through these ancient tales, and tonight we delve into one of the most closely guarded secrets in all of Tamriel's history. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me transport you to a time when magic itself hung in the balance. In the year 3E 431, 27 years before the Oblivion crisis would shake the very foundations of the Empire, the Imperial City stood as a beacon of magical learning. The white spires of the arcane university pierced the evening sky like ancient fingers reaching toward the stars, and within those hallowed halls, the greatest minds in magical research pursued knowledge that would shape the future of all Tamriel. But on this particular night, as autumn winds whistled through the cobblestone streets of the Imperial City, something far more sinister than academic rivalry was brewing in the shadows of the Guild's most sacred chambers. Our tale begins with Archmagus Venus Galerion III, great-grandson of the Guild's legendary founder. Unlike his illustrious ancestor, Venus III was a man haunted by visions, not of glory or magical advancement, but of an approaching darkness that would consume everything the Guild had built over the centuries. For months, strange reports had been filtering in from guild halls across the Empire. Mages were disappearing without explanation. Ancient texts were vanishing from supposedly secure vaults. Most disturbing of all, several high-ranking guild members had been found in their chambers, aged beyond recognition, their bodies withered as if decades had passed in a single night. The official reports blamed everything from necromantic attacks to Daedric interference, but Venus III knew better. He had felt the disturbance in the magical currents that flowed beneath Tamriel like invisible rivers. Something was feeding on magic itself, growing stronger with each passing day. On this fateful evening, as the bells of the Imperial City chimed midnight, Venus III made his way through the empty corridors of the arcane university. His footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors, each sound seeming to whisper secrets in the darkness. He clutched a leather-bound tome against his chest, the Chronicle of Forbidden Convergences, a book that supposedly didn't exist, containing knowledge so dangerous that previous Archmagi had ordered all copies destroyed. All copies, that is, except one. The Chronicle spoke of the Void Convergence, a theoretical magical phenomenon that could drain the mystical energy from the world itself. According to the ancient texts, such a convergence had been attempted once before, during the Dawn Era, by a cabal of Mer sorcerers who sought to become the sole masters of magic in Tamriel. Their experiment had supposedly failed, but the Chronicle suggested otherwise. What if they had succeeded? What if they had simply waited? As Venus III descended into the deepest levels of the university, levels that officially didn't exist on any architectural plans, he began to notice subtle changes in the air around him. The magical luminescence that normally bathed the guild halls in a soft, ethereal glow was dimming. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken, as if reality itself was becoming more solid. He paused at a seemingly blank wall, pressing his palm against a specific stone that looked identical to all the others. The wall shimmered and dissolved, revealing a spiral staircase that descended far deeper than any foundation should reach. This was the entrance to the Vault of Echoes, where the guild's most dangerous artifacts were kept under the Watch's guard. But tonight, there were no guards. The absence of the usual protective enchantments sent a chill down Venus III's spine. These weren't simple magical locks that could be picked or bypassed. They were fundamental alterations to the nature of space and time around the vault. Only someone with the highest level of guild access could have disabled them. Someone like a member of the Inner Council. As he descended the spiral staircase, each step taking him further from the familiar world above, Venus III began to hear voices echoing from below. Not the common tongue of Cyrodiil, nor the scholarly Aldmeris used in advanced magical discourse, but something far older. The words seemed to writhe in the air like living things, and each syllable made the chronicle in his arms grow heavier. The staircase opened into a vast circular chamber carved from what appeared to be a single piece of ebony. The walls were covered in inscriptions that hurt to look at directly, not because they were bright, but because they seemed to absorb light, creating patches of darkness deeper than shadow. In the center of the room stood 7 figures in hooded robes, their faces hidden, but their identities unmistakable to anyone familiar with the guild's hierarchy. The entire Inner Council was here. But they were not alone. Suspended above them, writhing in what appeared to be a web of crystallized magic, was something that Venus III's mind struggled to comprehend. It was neither fully present nor entirely absent, existing in that uncomfortable space between reality and void. As he watched, tendrils of magical energy flowed from various artifacts scattered around the chamber, all feeding into this impossible entity. "Archmagus," came a voice from beneath one of the hoods. Venus III recognized it as belonging to Master Cauldron Hort, his oldest friend and most trusted advisor. "You arrived just in time to witness the culmination of our work." "Cauldron?" Venus III's voice barely rose above a whisper. "What is this madness?" The hooded figure that had spoken pulled back its hood, revealing not the familiar face of his friend, but something far older and more terrible. The skin was translucent, showing dark veins that pulsed with unnatural energy. The eyes had been replaced by swirling voids that seemed to pull at Venus III's very soul. Madness? The thing that had once been Cauldron laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the ebony chamber. "This is salvation, old friend. For too long, magic has been scattered across Tamriel like seeds in the wind. Mages squabble over scraps of power while the true potential of the mystical arts remains locked away. But tonight, we change that." The other council members began to lower their hoods, revealing similar transformations. Some were further along than others. Master Yarrel's face had become completely ethereal, while apprentice Master Dalvia still retained some human features, though her hair had turned white as fresh snow. "The Void Convergence," Venus III breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You're actually attempting it." "Attempting?" Another voice spoke, this one coming from directly above. The impossible entity suspended in the crystallized web was speaking, its words bypassing his ears entirely and resonating directly in his mind. "My dear Archmagus, we have already succeeded." The truth hit Venus III like a physical blow. The disappearing mages, the withered bodies, the failing magic across the empire. It wasn't the beginning of the convergence. It was the end result. The process had been ongoing for months, perhaps years, slowly draining magical energy from across Tamriel and concentrating it here, in this hidden chamber beneath the very heart of the guild. "How long?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The first preparations began when your grandfather was still Archmagus," the entity replied, and Vanus III could feel its terrible amusement. "We have been patient, collecting allies, gathering power, waiting for the proper celestial alignment. Tonight, the moons are dark, the barriers between realms are at their weakest, and we can finally complete our great work." Around the chamber, Vanus III began to notice details that his mind had initially refused to process. The artifacts feeding energy to the entity weren't just random magical items. They were some of the most powerful relics in the guild's possession. The Staff of Magnus, supposedly locked away in the deepest vaults. The Amulet of King's Echo, a replica of the Empire's most sacred artifact. The Ayleid Crown of Nenalata, thought lost for over 1,000 years. But most disturbing of all was what lay at the center of the ritual circle. It was a book, but not just any book. The original chronicle of forbidden convergences, the master copy from which all others had been transcribed. Its pages were turning by themselves, and with each page that turned, the entity above grew more solid, more real. "You've been feeding it guild knowledge," Vanus III realized. "Every spell we've developed, every magical breakthrough, every secret we've uncovered, you've been offering it all to this thing." "Not offering," corrected the entity. "Trading. In exchange for the knowledge your guild has accumulated over centuries, I have given these loyal servants a glimpse of true power. Power that transcends the petty limitations of mortal magic." The chronicle in Vanus III's arms suddenly felt as heavy as lead. He looked down at it and saw that its pages were glowing with the same unholy light that surrounded the entity above. The book wasn't just a record of the Void Convergence, it was a key component of it. By bringing it here, he had played directly into their hands. "Did you really think we were unaware of your investigations?" The thing that had been Cauldron stepped closer, its void eyes fixed on the chronicle. "Every question you asked, every text you consulted, every late-night research session, we knew about all of it. We wanted you to find that book. We needed you to bring it here tonight." The terrible logic of the trap became clear. Vanus III was the final component they needed. Not just his knowledge, but his authority as Archmagus. The Void Convergence required willing sacrifice from the highest levels of the guild's hierarchy. By bringing the chronicle here of his own free will, he had provided the last piece of their apocalyptic puzzle. "The other guild halls," he said desperately. "Surely someone will notice when magic begins to fail across the Empire." "Magic will not fail," the entity replied, and now its voice carried a note of triumph. "It will simply consolidate. Instead of thousands of mages with limited power, there will be one with unlimited potential. Instead of magic scattered across a dozen schools and hundreds of techniques, there will be unified understanding. The Mages Guild will truly become what its name implies, a single guild with a single master." As if responding to these words, the crystallized web began to pulse more rapidly. Vanus III could feel his own magical energy being drawn out of him, pulled inexorably toward the entity above. Around the chamber, similar streams of energy were flowing from the transformed council members, but rather than weakening them, the process seemed to be making them stronger, more solid, more real. He understood then what was happening. This wasn't just about concentrating magical power, it was about fundamentally changing the nature of magic itself. The entity above wasn't from Tamriel, or even from any of the known realms of Oblivion. It was something from the void itself, the space between realities where neither matter nor energy could exist in their familiar forms. But the Void Convergence was allowing it to take root in this reality, to become the new source and master of all magical energy in Tamriel. And the Mages Guild, the institution that had been built to study and preserve magical knowledge, was being used as the anchor point for this cosmic violation. There has to be another way, Vanis III said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew it was too late. The process had already gone too far. Magic is meant to be shared, studied, explored by many minds working together. No single entity should control it all. Spoken like a true descendant of Vanus Galerion, the entity mused. Your ancestor founded the guild on the principle that magic should be available to all who could learn it. But he never considered the chaos that would result from such freedom. Look at what his legacy has wrought. Necromancers turning magic to evil ends. Summoners calling forth Daedra to plague the mortal realm. Battle mages turning the mystical arts into tools of war and conquest. The argument was seductive in its simplicity, but Vanus III could see the flaw in its logic. And what will you do differently? How will centralizing all magical power in a single entity prevent these same abuses? Because, the entity replied, and its voice now seemed to come from everywhere at once. There will be no other entities capable of magic. I will become the living embodiment of all mystical arts, the sole practitioner and guardian of arcane knowledge. Through me, magic will finally achieve its true potential. The chronicle in Vanus III's arms began to smoke, its pages turning faster and faster. He could feel the knowledge contained within being pulled out of the book and absorbed by the entity above. Centuries of magical research, millennia of accumulated wisdom, all flowing into this alien intelligence that would reshape the very foundations of reality. But as the entity grew stronger, Vanus III noticed something else. The transformed council members were beginning to fade, their forms becoming less solid with each passing moment. The entity wasn't just absorbing magical knowledge, it was consuming the very essence of those who had served it. You're killing them, he said, pointing at the increasingly transparent figures around the chamber. I am preserving them, the entity corrected. Their mortal forms are crude vessels, limited by flesh and bone and the biological needs of organic life. By absorbing their essence, I ensure that their knowledge and experience will be preserved forever, integrated into a greater understanding that transcends individual limitations. Cauldron's form had become so translucent that Vanus III could see the ebony wall through his body. But the thing that had been his friend still smiled with those terrible void eyes. It doesn't hurt, Vanus, Cauldron whispered, his voice now barely audible. It's like coming home. All the questions I've struggled with for decades, all the magical theories I could never quite grasp. Suddenly it all makes sense. I can see the patterns that connect everything, the fundamental structures that underlie all reality. It's beautiful. One by one, the other council members began to fade as well, their individual consciousness merging with the entity above. Master Yril was the first to disappear completely, his form dissolving into motes of light that flowed upward into the crystallized web. Apprentice Master Dolvia followed soon after, her final words a whispered blessing in the old Aldmeri tongue. As each consciousness was absorbed, the entity grew more solid, more present. What had begun as an abstract writhing of impossible geometry was now taking on a more recognizable form. Humanoid, but stretched and distorted in ways that suggested vast intelligence compressed into an inadequate vessel. The chronicle in Venus III's arms finally burst into flames, but rather than burning, the fire flowed upward like liquid light, carrying with it the last of the guild's accumulated knowledge. The weight in his arms disappeared, leaving him holding nothing but empty air and ash. "And now," the entity said, its voice no longer coming from above, but from all around, "the final component." Venus III felt the pull immediately, not just on his magical energy, but on his very sense of self. The entity was trying to absorb him just as it had the others, to add his knowledge and authority to its growing collection of stolen consciousness. But something was different. Perhaps it was his bloodline connection to the guild's founder, or perhaps it was simply the desperate love he felt for the institution his family had built. But Venus III found that he could resist the pull, at least temporarily. In that moment of resistance, he made a choice that would echo through the centuries to come. Rather than fight the entity's absorption directly, which he knew he could not win, Venus III reached deep into his own magical reserves and cast a spell that no Archmagus had ever attempted before. He began to deliberately destabilize his own magical essence, turning his life force into a kind of magical bomb that would detonate the moment the entity tried to absorb him. "What are you doing?" the entity demanded, and for the first time, Venus III heard genuine alarm in its voice. "Something my great-grandfather would have done," Venus III replied, feeling his body begin to vibrate with barely contained energy. "I'm ensuring that the Mage's Guild dies on its own terms." The entity tried to stop the absorption process, to release its hold on him before the magical explosion could occur, but it was too late. The Void Convergence had created a connection between them that could not be easily severed. The unstable magical energy began to flow from Venus III into the entity, and with it came not power, but chaos. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystallized web that had been focusing the absorbed magical energy began to crack and shatter. The artifacts around the chamber erupted in uncontrolled magical discharges. The ebony walls, which had been carved with void-touched inscriptions, began to crack and crumble as the very space they defined became unstable. But most importantly, the magical energy that the entity had been hoarding, drawing from mages across the empire for months or years, began to disperse back into the world. Like a dam bursting, centuries of accumulated power flowed out of the chamber and back to its original sources. Across Tamriel, mages who had been struggling with failing spells suddenly found their power restored. Guild halls that had been growing cold and dark blazed with renewed magical light. Apprentices who had despaired of ever mastering the simplest cantrips discovered that their abilities had suddenly expanded beyond anything they had imagined possible. But the price of this restoration was steep. The arcane university, the physical and spiritual heart of the Mages Guild, could not contain the magical energies now raging through its foundations. The white spires that had stood for centuries began to crack and topple. The great libraries, with their countless scrolls and tomes, burst into flames that burned with every color of the magical spectrum. In the hidden chamber beneath it all, Venus III felt his consciousness beginning to fragment as the magical explosion reached its peak. But even as his individual awareness dissolved, he was aware of the entity's death scream echoing through the void, and he knew that the threat had been ended. The last thing he remembered was the sight of dawn light streaming down through the collapsing ruins above, carrying with it the promise that magic would continue to flourish in Tamriel, wild and free and belonging to no single master. When rescue teams finally reached the ruins of the Arcane University 3 days later, they found no trace of the Inner Council or the Archmagus. The official records would state that a magical experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, claiming the lives of the Guild's entire leadership and destroying centuries of accumulated research. But some secrets survived. Hidden caches of knowledge scattered across the Empire by paranoid previous Archmagi. Backup libraries maintained by individual guild halls. Most importantly, the living memory of hundreds of mages who had been trained in the guild's methods and could carry on its traditions even without a central institution. The Mages Guild as a unified organization was dead, but magic itself lived on. In the decades that followed, smaller groups of mages would form new institutions: the Synod, the College of Whispers, independent magical academies in various provinces. None would ever achieve the scope or influence of the original guild, but perhaps that was for the better. For in the end, Venus Galerian's vision had proved correct. Magic was too vast, too varied, too essentially chaotic to be controlled by any single entity, whether mortal or otherwise. It belonged to everyone who had the will to study it and the wisdom to use it responsibly. And in the quiet corners of Tamriel, where the barriers between the known and unknown grow thin, some say you can still hear echoes of that terrible night when magic almost died. The wind through ruined towers carries whispers of forbidden knowledge. The aurora dancing above Skyrim's peaks sometimes forms patterns that look almost like spells written in light across the sky. They say magic never truly dies, and perhaps that's true. But on one fateful night, the Mages Guild learned that sometimes the only way to save something you love is to let it go. And so ends our tale of the night magic almost died, when the very institution meant to protect mystical knowledge became the instrument of its near destruction. In the ruins of the Arcane University, a lesson was written in stone and ash: that power shared is power preserved, and that even the greatest magical institutions are only as strong as the principles upon which they are founded. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that in the world of the Elder Scrolls, magic flows like an invisible river beneath all of reality, connecting every living thing in an endless web of possibility. And perhaps, in your dreams, you too might touch that mystical current and discover wonders beyond imagination. Rest well, my fellow travelers through the realms of Tamriel, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle light of stars and the whispered secrets of ancient tomes. Sleep peacefully, and let the magic of dreams carry you to distant lands where adventure awaits with the rising sun.